The rock struck the German shepherd's ribs with a sickening thud, and Garrett William Thompson's weathered hands froze mid-reach for his morning coffee. The 72-year-old retired history teacher watched in stunned silence as 20 angry residents of Magnolia Springs surrounded the lone dog in Memorial Park, their faces twisted with a fury he hadn't seen since the integration riots of 1963. This wasn't just another stray causing trouble. The shepherd sat perfectly still beside the Civil War monument, amber eyes reflecting an intelligence that made Will's chest tighten with recognition. Margaret Chen Williams screamed as another stone found its mark, her designer purse tumbling to the sidewalk. Children pressed their faces against car windows while their parents grabbed more ammunition from the landscaping. The morning air filled with shouts of rabid and dangerous, drowning out the dog's silent dignity. Will remembered Elizabeth's final words about second chances, about seeing past broken exteriors to wounded hearts. His arthritic knees protested as he stepped between the mob and the bleeding animal. Not one more stone, his voice cracked across the humid September morning. But what happened next would shatter everything this small Alabama town thought they knew about heroes, villains, and the thin line between salvation and destruction. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Memorial Park had been the beating heart of Magnolia Springs, Alabama for over 50 years, its ancient oak trees casting protective shadows over generations of Sunday picnics, marriage proposals, and quiet contemplation. The bronze Civil War monument stood sentinel at its center, weathered hands of Confederate soldiers forever reaching skyward, surrounded by benches where old-timers gathered each morning to solve the world's problems over steaming cups of coffee and bitter memories. Garrett William Thompson had claimed the same corner bench for 3 years now, ever since Elizabeth's funeral. At 72, his once broad shoulders carried the weight of a lifetime spent teaching high school history and the heavier burden of profound loneliness. His silver hair, meticulously combed despite having no one to impress, caught the early morning light filtering through Spanish moss. The deep lines around his pale blue eyes spoke of countless nights spent staring at Elizabeth's empty chair, wondering how a man could share 47 years with someone and still have so much left unsaid. "Lizzie always said this park was God's waiting room," he murmured to himself, a habit he'd developed since her passing. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he lifted his thermos, the same blue one Elizabeth had packed for his lunch every school day for decades. The coffee tasted bitter now. Everything did without her gentle teasing about his stubborn refusal to add sugar. The German shepherd had appeared 3 days ago like a ghost materializing from his grief-stricken imagination. 8 years old, the veterinarian would later estimate, with intelligent amber eyes that seemed to hold secrets and scars that spoke of a life lived in service to others. The dog's black and tan coat bore patches of missing fur, and his right rear leg carried a permanent limp that didn't diminish his dignified bearing. Most remarkably, he positioned himself each morning beside the veteran's monument as if reporting for duty, scanning the park with the focused attention of a trained guardian. Dorothy Mae Patterson, 68, and fighting her own war against the crushing loneliness of widowhood, had been the first to notice the dog's unusual behavior. "That animal's got more sense than most people in this town," she'd whispered to Margaret Chen Williams during their Tuesday morning walk. Margaret, recently divorced after 40 years of marriage, found herself oddly comforted by the shepherd's steadfast presence. "At least someone knows where they belong," she'd replied with the bitter wisdom of a woman rediscovering her identity. But not everyone saw dignity in the stray's arrival. Marcus Eugene Bradford III, CEO of Bradford Development Group and heir to 3 generations of real estate dominance, viewed the dog through a different lens entirely. At 48, Bradford carried himself with the practiced confidence of inherited wealth, his expensive suits and perfectly maintained appearance masking the psychological scars left by a childhood trauma involving a German Shepherd. The $50 million resort development he'd planned for Memorial Park's acreage represented more than profit. It was his chance to erase painful memories by burying them under concrete and steel. As Will watched the morning crowd gather, he couldn't shake the feeling that this beautiful, broken dog was somehow connected to his own beautiful, broken heart. The first stone had been thrown by Tommy Bradford, Marcus's 16-year-old son, though he'd later swear under oath that his father had pressured him into it. The German Shepherd didn't flinch when the rock struck his shoulder, didn't growl or bare his teeth as any normal stray might. Instead, Duke, as Will had begun calling him in his mind, simply turned those remarkable amber eyes toward the growing crowd with what could only be described as disappointment. "That dog's been lurking around here for 3 days," shouted Patricia Montgomery, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd run the Magnolia Springs Garden Club for 23 years. "My grandbaby won't even play on the swings anymore. She's so scared." Will watched as more residents joined the mob, their faces twisted with a mob mentality he recognized from his years teaching about historical injustices. Sarah Beth Coleman clutched her toddler closer to her chest, while her husband Jim hefted another rock with the determination of a man protecting his family from a perceived threat. The morning sun cast long shadows across the park, turning the peaceful gathering space into something that resembled a medieval tribunal. "Now hold on just a minute," Will called out, his teacher's voice cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. "What exactly has this dog done to deserve this treatment?" Marcus Bradford stepped forward from the crowd, his expensive Italian shoes crunching on the gravel path. Even at this early hour, he was immaculately dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Will's monthly pension. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his smile carried the calculated warmth of a politician during election season. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate your concern for animal welfare," Bradford said, his voice smooth as Alabama honey. "But we have to think about public safety. This is an unvaccinated stray with unpredictable behavior. What if he attacks a child? What if he's carrying diseases?" The crowd murmured agreement, fear spreading like wildfire through their ranks. Will noticed how Bradford positioned himself as the reasonable voice of caution, the responsible adult making tough decisions for the greater good. It was a masterful performance, Will had to admit, even as every instinct screamed that something wasn't right about this situation. Duke remained motionless throughout the confrontation, his intelligent gaze moving from face to face as if memorizing each person present. When a particularly large rock struck his injured leg, he let out a soft whimper, but still didn't move from his position beside the monument. The sound cut through Will's heart like a rusty blade, awakening something protective he hadn't felt since Elizabeth's illness. "Look at him," Will said, gesturing toward the dog. "Does that look like an aggressive animal to you? He's been sitting in the same spot for 3 days, bothering no one, threatening no one." "That's exactly what makes him dangerous," Bradford countered smoothly. "Unpredictable behavior is the first sign of rabies. We can't take chances with our children's safety." He pulled out his cell phone with theatrical precision. "I'm calling animal control right now. This situation has gone on long enough." Dorothy Patterson pushed through the crowd, her white hair wild from the morning humidity and her floral dress wrinkled from sleep. At 68, she moved with the determined gait of a woman who'd spent decades managing unruly church committees and obstinate husbands. "Marcus Bradford, you should be ashamed of yourself," she declared, her voice carrying across the park like a Sunday sermon. "That poor creature hasn't hurt a soul, and here you are inciting violence against him." "Mrs. Patterson, with all due respect," Bradford replied, his tone becoming slightly less honeyed, "you're letting emotion cloud your judgment. This is a matter of public health and safety." Margaret Chen Williams arrived breathless, having heard the commotion from her morning jog. Her divorce had left her feeling invisible and irrelevant. But something about the shepherd's quiet dignity resonated with her own struggle to find purpose in her new life. "What's happening here?" she demanded, taking in the scene of grown adults throwing rocks at a defenseless animal. "Community self-defense," Bradford answered before anyone else could speak. "Though I suppose some people prefer to wait until tragedy strikes before taking preventive action." Will felt his blood pressure rising, a dangerous sensation given his recent cardiac episodes. Preventive action? Against what crime? Sitting peacefully in a public park? He turned to address the crowd directly, drawing on decades of classroom management experience. When did we become the kind of people who attack the vulnerable instead of protecting them? The morning air grew thick with tension as the community found itself split down the middle. Some nodded in agreement with Will's words, while others clutched their children closer and eyed Duke with suspicion. The German shepherd seemed to sense the division, his ears drooping slightly as he looked up at Will with eyes that held what appeared to be gratitude mixed with resignation. Neither Will nor the gathering crowd could have predicted that this moment would mark the beginning of a battle that would divide their small town, expose long-buried secrets, and ultimately reveal truths that would shake the very foundation of everything they thought they knew about loyalty, betrayal, and the price of silence. The turning point came on Thursday morning when 6-year-old Lily Chen was walking to school through Memorial Park, her pink backpack bouncing with each skip. Margaret Chen Williams had been watching from her kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, when she noticed the white van with tinted windows idling near the playground equipment. Something about the vehicle's position, partially hidden behind the maintenance shed, triggered an alarm in her maternal instincts, even though Lily wasn't her granddaughter. Duke noticed it too. The German shepherd's entire demeanor shifted from peaceful guardian to alert sentinel, his ears pricked forward and his powerful body tensing like a coiled spring. For 3 days, he'd endured rocks and verbal abuse without reacting, but now something primal awakened in his amber eyes, the protective instinct that years of police training had honed to razor sharpness. The man who emerged from the van moved with calculated casualness, his baseball cap pulled low and his hands tucked into a worn denim jacket. He approached Lily with the practiced smoothness of someone who'd done this before, crouching down to her level and speaking in hushed tones that Margaret couldn't hear from her window. But she could see Lily's body language change from curious to confused to frightened as the stranger's grip tightened on her small wrist. Duke exploded into motion with a speed that defied his injured leg. The shepherd crossed 50 yards in seconds, his powerful frame low to the ground and his focus laser-sharp on the threat to the child. His approach was silent, professional, deadly. Not the crazed attack of a rabid animal, but the controlled intervention of a trained protector. The would-be kidnapper looked up just as Duke launched himself through the air, 80 pounds of muscle and determination aimed directly at his chest. The impact sent the man sprawling backward, releasing his grip on Lily and sending his baseball cap flying. Duke positioned himself between the child and her attacker, hackles raised and teeth bared in a display of controlled aggression that left no doubt about his intentions. Margaret dropped her coffee mug, the ceramic exploding against her kitchen floor as she fumbled for her cell phone. 911, I need police at Memorial Park immediately. There's a man trying to kidnap a little girl. Lily Chen stood frozen for a moment, her 6-year-old mind struggling to process what had just happened. Then training kicked in, stranger danger lessons from school, her mother's warnings about never going with people she didn't know. She turned and ran toward the street, her pink backpack streaming behind her like a banner of salvation. The kidnapper scrambled to his feet, his face now visible without the concealing cap. Margaret would later describe him to police as mid-30s, pale, with the desperate look of someone whose carefully planned crime had just been destroyed by an unexpected variable. He took one look at Duke's unwavering stare and the approaching sirens Margaret's call had summoned, then sprinted toward his van with the graceless panic of prey fleeing a predator. Duke held his position until the white van screeched out of the park, tires smoking against asphalt. Only then did his rigid posture relax, and he sat down calmly beside the playground equipment, his tongue lolling out slightly, as if he'd just completed a routine patrol. When the first police car arrived 3 minutes later, they found him sitting exactly where he'd been for the past 3 days, a faithful guardian at his post. Officer Rebecca Martinez emerged from her cruiser with hand on weapon, responding to a kidnapping call but finding only a German shepherd and an increasingly gathering crowd of neighbors. "Where's the perpetrator?" she called out, scanning the area for threats. "Gone!" Margaret shouted from her front porch, still in her bathrobe. "The dog scared him off. He saved that little girl." Within minutes, the park filled with residents drawn by the sirens and spreading news of the attempted abduction. Will Thompson arrived breathless, having heard the commotion from his apartment 6 blocks away. He found Duke surrounded by the same people who'd been throwing rocks at him just hours earlier, their expressions now a mixture of awe and shame. Dorothy Patterson knelt beside the shepherd, her weathered hands gently stroking his head. "Good boy," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Such a good boy." Duke leaned into her touch, his amber eyes closing briefly in what appeared to be relief at receiving kindness instead of cruelty. Marcus Bradford's arrival shattered the moment of unity. He pushed through the crowd with the determined stride of a man whose carefully laid plans had just been disrupted by forces beyond his control. His expensive suit was slightly rumpled, suggesting he'd dressed hastily upon hearing the news, and his usually perfect hair showed signs of stress-induced disorder. "I want that animal tested immediately," Bradford announced to Officer Martinez, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Rabid dogs can display unpredictable behavior, sometimes appearing protective, sometimes violent. This incident proves he's dangerous. The crowd's murmur of agreement from earlier that morning had transformed into something else entirely. Sarah Beth Coleman, who'd been clutching her toddler in fear just hours before, stepped forward with fierce protectiveness. "That dog saved Lily Chen from being kidnapped, and you want him tested for rabies? Are you out of your mind?" "I want him tested for everything," Bradford replied coolly. "Rabies, aggressive tendencies, unpredictable behavior patterns. Just because his violence happened to serve a useful purpose this time doesn't mean we can trust him with our children's safety." Will watched Bradford's performance with growing suspicion. Something about the man's reaction seemed calculated, rehearsed, as if he'd been preparing arguments against Duke long before this morning's events. The timing felt wrong, the responses too polished for someone genuinely concerned about public safety. "Officer Martinez," Will said, his teacher's instincts detecting deception with the same accuracy he'd once used to spot cheating students. "I think you need to check the park's security cameras. I have a feeling this morning's events will tell us more about Duke's true nature than Mr. Bradford's theories about rabid behavior." The suggestion hung in the morning air like a challenge, and Will noticed Bradford's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Something was very wrong here, and Duke, sitting calmly beside the monument like the guardian angel he'd proven himself to be, might just be the key to exposing whatever truth Marcus Bradford was so desperate to hide. The security footage from Magnolia Springs Memorial Park told a story that left Officer Rebecca Martinez speechless. Sitting in the cramped security office of the Parks and Recreation Department, Will Thompson watched over her shoulder as 3 weeks of digital evidence unfolded on the grainy monitor. What they discovered wasn't just proof of Duke's heroism, It was a revelation that would fundamentally change how everyone in town viewed the German Shepherd they'd been so quick to condemn. "Sweet Lord in heaven," Dorothy Patterson whispered, her hand pressed to her heart as the first incident played out on screen. The timestamp read September 3rd, 2:17 a.m., 2 days before Duke's public appearance in the park. The infrared camera showed a figure in dark clothing attempting to break into the park's maintenance shed where expensive lawn equipment was stored. Duke emerged from the shadows like a ghost, positioning himself between the would-be thief and the building with military precision. The intruder took one look at the Shepherd's alert stance and fled without taking anything. Officer Martinez paused the footage and looked at the small group gathered around the monitor. "This dog has been protecting park property for almost a month," she said, her voice tinged with amazement, "and nobody knew he was here." The second incident, dated September 8th, showed Duke preventing a drug deal near the children's playground. 3 teenagers had arrived with backpacks and nervous energy, clearly intending to conduct business in what they assumed was a safe, secluded location. Duke's appearance sent them scattering like leaves in a windstorm, leaving behind evidence that police later used to identify a growing drug problem in the high school. But it was the third incident that brought tears to Margaret Chen Williams's eyes. On September 12th, the cameras captured Duke finding elderly Robert Kensington collapsed on a park bench during his evening walk. The 78-year-old retiree had suffered a mild heart attack and lay unconscious while Duke paced anxiously beside him. The Shepherd's persistent barking, the same aggressive behavior residents had complained about, had summoned help from a passing jogger who called 911. Robert was alive today because of Duke's intervention. "How many times?" Will asked quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "How many times has he saved someone while we were calling him a menace?" Officer Martinez fast-forwarded through hours of footage showing Duke's daily routine. The pattern was always the same: arrive at dawn, position himself strategically near the monument where he could observe all park entrances, patrol the perimeter every 2 hours with military precision, then return to his post. During the day, he interacted gently with children, ignored joggers and dog walkers unless they appeared distressed, and maintained a vigilant watch over the entire area. "He's not just a stray," Martinez realized aloud. "This is trained behavior, professional-level K-9 work." She picked up her radio and contacted the police station. "This is Martinez. I need you to run a check on military and police K-9 databases for a German Shepherd, approximately 8 years old, black and tan coloring, distinctive scarring on right rear leg." While they waited for the database results, Will found himself studying Duke's recorded interactions with park visitors. The dog's body language spoke volumes to anyone who understood canine behavior. When children approached, his ears relaxed and his tail wagged in controlled, gentle movements. With elderly visitors, he positioned himself close enough to provide assistance if needed, but far enough away to avoid causing alarm. Joggers received polite acknowledgement, a lifted head, alert eyes, but no interference with their activities. The most telling footage showed Duke's reaction to various adults who'd approached the park over the past weeks. With most visitors, he remained calm and observant. But with certain individuals, always men, always alone, always exhibiting what animal behaviorists call predatory scanning, Duke's demeanor shifted dramatically. His hackles would rise, his stance would become rigid, and he would position himself to intervene if necessary. "Look at this," Dorothy said, pointing to the screen where Duke was tracking a man who'd been watching the playground from an unusual distance. The timestamp showed September 15th, just 3 days before Lily Chen's near abduction. He knew. Somehow, he knew that man was trouble. Officer Martinez's radio crackled to life with the database results. "Martinez, We've got a match on your K9 inquiry. German Shepherd named Duke, badge number K247, retired from Birmingham Police Department 18 months ago after leg injury sustained in the line of duty. Handler was Officer David Chen. Wait, that's interesting. Chen's daughter reported her father missing 6 months ago. Last known address was a cabin about 30 miles north of your location. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Margaret Chen Williams gripped the back of Will's chair, her knuckles white with tension. "Chen," she whispered. "Lily Chen. That's my... Oh my God. He's been protecting his handler's granddaughter." The pieces began falling into place with heartbreaking clarity. Officer David Chen had retired after Duke's injury, but something had happened to him 6 months ago. Duke had somehow made his way to Magnolia Springs, to the park where his handler's family lived, where he could continue his protective duties even without his badge and uniform. Will felt his chest tighten with emotion as he watched Duke on the monitor, maintaining his faithful vigil. "He came home," Will said softly. He found his way to the one place where he could still serve, still protect the people he was trained to care for. Dr. Patricia Hawkins from the county animal shelter arrived within an hour of Officer Martinez's call. A veterinarian with 30 years of experience working with retired police and military dogs, she examined Duke with gentle expertise while the small crowd watched anxiously. Her findings confirmed what the security footage had suggested. Duke was a professionally trained, highly disciplined working dog suffering from arthritis in his injured leg, but otherwise in remarkable health. "This animal has been surviving on his own for months," Dr. Hawkins explained as she completed her examination. "He's underweight and dehydrated, but his muscle memory and training instincts are intact. Someone invested years in teaching him to protect and serve, and that programming doesn't just disappear because his handler is no longer there." The veterinarian's mention of Duke's missing handler cast a shadow over the group's growing excitement. Officer Martinez had already contacted Birmingham PD about David Chen's disappearance, but months of searching had yielded no clues about what had happened to the retired cop and his faithful partner. Margaret Chen Williams knelt beside Duke, her hands trembling as she stroked his scarred head. "You've been looking after Lily all this time, haven't you?" she whispered. "You knew she was family." Duke's amber eyes met hers with an intelligence that seemed almost human, and his tail wagged once in what appeared to be acknowledgment. Word of Duke's true identity spread through Magnolia Springs faster than kudzu in summer. By afternoon, a steady stream of visitors had arrived at Memorial Park to meet the dog they'd misjudged so severely. Children who'd been forbidden to play near Duke the week before now begged their parents for permission to pet the hero dog. Their parents, shamefaced and humbled, watched as Duke patiently endured countless gentle touches and whispered apologies. Sarah Beth Coleman arrived with her toddler and a bag of premium dog treats, her earlier fear replaced by maternal gratitude. "I'm so sorry we misunderstood you," she told Duke, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you for keeping our baby safe." But not everyone in town was celebrating Duke's revelation. Marcus Bradford received the news of the security footage with barely concealed anger, his carefully constructed narrative about the dangerous stray crumbling faster than he could rebuild it. When confronted with video evidence of Duke's protective behavior, Bradford doubled down on his opposition with increasing desperation. "Training makes him more dangerous, not less," Bradford argued during an impromptu town meeting called for that evening. "A dog with police training knows how to attack efficiently. What happens when his programming malfunctions? What happens when he confuses an innocent person for a threat?" Will stood up from his seat in the crowded community center, his patience finally exhausted. "Marcus, what exactly is your problem with this dog? He saved lives, prevented crimes, and protected our children. What more do you want from him?" Bradford's composed facade slipped for just a moment, revealing something darker underneath. "I want him gone," he said with quiet intensity. "This town doesn't need a vigilante dog operating outside proper authority. It sets a dangerous precedent." The room erupted in arguments as the community split between those who saw Duke as a hero and those who bought into Bradford's fears. Dorothy Patterson stood up slowly, her age giving weight to her words as the room gradually quieted. "I've lived in this town for 68 years," she said, her voice carrying across the room like Sunday morning church bells. "I've seen a lot of people come and go, and I've learned to recognize the difference between someone who protects and someone who controls." Her eyes fixed on Bradford with unsettling directness. "That dog has been nothing but a blessing to this community. The question isn't what's wrong with him, it's what's wrong with anyone who can't see that." As the meeting dissolved into heated discussions and divided factions, Will noticed Bradford's son Jeremy sitting alone in the back row. The 16-year-old looked miserable, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something that looked suspiciously like guilt. When their eyes met, Jeremy quickly looked away, but not before Will caught something important in the boy's expression, the look of someone carrying a secret too heavy to bear alone. Outside the community center, Duke waited patiently beside Will's truck, as if sensing that his fate was being decided by the humans inside. The shepherd's calm acceptance of whatever would come broke Will's heart and strengthened his resolve simultaneously. Whatever Marcus Bradford's real agenda was, Will was determined to uncover it before the man's influence could destroy the best thing that had happened to Magnolia Springs in years. The battle lines were drawn, but Will suspected the real war was just beginning. The climax began building on a humid Tuesday morning when Will Thompson discovered something that made his blood run cold. He'd been going through Elizabeth's personal effects, a painful task he'd postponed for 3 years, when he found her leather-bound journal hidden beneath their wedding photos. Elizabeth had always been a meticulous record keeper, documenting everything from grocery lists to family milestones, but this journal contained entries that Will had never seen before. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks before her death, was written in Elizabeth's increasingly shaky handwriting. "Will doesn't remember Duke anymore." The Alzheimer's support group said this might happen, that caregivers sometimes suppress memories that are too painful. "I've hidden Duke's collar and papers in the kitchen pantry, behind the flour canister. Someday when Will is ready to heal, maybe he'll remember our beautiful boy who helped us through the worst days. Duke is staying with David Chen until I'm gone. I pray they find each other again." Will's hands trembled as the words sank in. Duke wasn't just any retired police dog. He was their Duke, the therapy dog Elizabeth had trained to help her through the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. The memories came flooding back like a broken dam. Duke's gentle presence during Elizabeth's confused nights, his ability to guide her home when she wandered, his steadfast comfort during Will's breakdown after her diagnosis. The grief had been so overwhelming that Will's mind had simply erased Duke from his memories, packaging away the pain along with the joy. David Chen, Duke's former handler, had agreed to care for the dog temporarily while Elizabeth was in hospice care. But then David had disappeared 6 months ago, and Duke had somehow found his way back to the only other person who'd ever truly loved him. Will's discovery coincided with Marcus Bradford's most aggressive assault yet on Duke's presence in the community. Bradford had hired a team of lawyers and was threatening to sue the city for maintaining a public nuisance if they didn't remove the dog immediately. He'd also begun spreading rumors about Duke's past, claiming the dog had been discharged from police service for aggression rather than injury. "I've obtained Duke's service records," Bradford announced at an emergency city council meeting called for Thursday evening. The community center was packed beyond capacity, with supporters and opponents of Duke facing off in an atmosphere thick with tension. This animal was involved in multiple use-of-force incidents during his police career. He's trained to attack, and his conditioning makes him unpredictable around civilians. Dorothy Patterson rose from her seat with the righteous fury of a woman who'd endured enough nonsense for one lifetime. "Marcus Bradford, you are a lying snake in the grass," she declared, her voice carrying across the crowded room. "That dog has done nothing but protect this community, and you know it." Bradford's polished composure never wavered. "Mrs. Patterson, I understand you're emotionally attached to the animal, but we have to be guided by facts, not feelings. Professional assessments clearly indicate—" "What professional assessments?" Will interrupted, standing up from his seat near the front. "Show us these service records you claim to have. Let the community see this evidence you're using to condemn an innocent animal." Bradford hesitated for just a moment, a tiny crack in his confident facade that Will didn't miss. "Those records contain sensitive law enforcement information that can't be disclosed publicly." Officer Martinez, who'd been silent until now, stood up from her position near the back wall. "Mr. Bradford, I've reviewed Duke's actual service records from Birmingham PD. They show nothing but commendations for bravery and exemplary conduct. I'm curious about where you obtained different information." The room buzzed with murmurs as Bradford's credibility began to crumble. Mayor Patricia Sims, a practical woman in her 60s who'd been trying to remain neutral, leaned forward at the council table. "Mr. Bradford, if Officer Martinez has reviewed the official records, perhaps you could clarify the source of your conflicting information." Bradford's jaw tightened, and Will noticed beads of perspiration forming on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "My sources are confidential, but the liability issues remain the same. This city cannot afford the lawsuits that will follow when that dog inevitably attacks someone." "The only attack I've seen," called out Sarah Beth Coleman from the middle of the room, "was when 20 adults threw rocks at a dog who was doing nothing but sitting peacefully in a public park." The crowd erupted in arguments, voices rising as neighbors turned against neighbors. Team Duke supporters faced off against Bradford's followers, who'd been convinced that the dog posed a genuine threat to community safety. In the chaos, Will noticed Jeremy Bradford slipping out of the meeting through a side door, his face pale and his movements furtive. Following an instinct honed by decades of teaching troubled teenagers, Will quietly left his seat and followed Jeremy outside. He found the boy sitting on the community center steps, his head in his hands and his shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. "Jeremy," Will said gently, settling beside him on the concrete steps. "You look like you've got something weighing on your mind." The 16-year-old looked up with tears streaming down his face. "Mr. Thompson, I can't do this anymore. My dad, he's making me lie, and it's killing me inside." Will felt his heart rate accelerate. "What kind of lies, son?" Jeremy's voice broke as the truth poured out. "The dog bite, the scar on my arm that Dad always talks about, it wasn't from a German Shepherd attack 8 years ago. I fell off my bike and got caught in some barbed wire when I was visiting my grandpa's farm. Dad made up the whole story about a vicious dog attack because he needed an excuse." "An excuse for what?" "For hating Duke, for wanting him gone." Jeremy wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Dad's been planning that resort development for 2 years. He's already got investors lined up, contracts ready to sign, but the city won't sell him the parkland while it's being used as a community space. He figured if he could prove the park was dangerous, if he could get people scared of using it, the city council would be more willing to sell." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Bradford hadn't developed a sudden concern for public safety. He'd orchestrated a campaign of fear and misinformation to serve his own financial interests. The German Shepherd's arrival had been an unexpected gift, a ready-made villain for Bradford's narrative. Jeremy, are you saying your father manufactured evidence against Duke? The boy nodded miserably. He hired actors to pretend Duke attacked them. He paid off that guy who claimed Duke bit him last week, gave him $500 to lie to the police. And the photos he showed the city council of bite marks, those were from a different case, downloaded from the internet. Will's anger burned white hot, but his teacher's instincts kept his voice calm and reassuring. Son, you're doing the right thing by telling the truth. But this needs to be reported to the proper authorities. I know, Jeremy whispered. But he's my dad. If I testify against him, it'll destroy our family. Mom doesn't know anything about this. She actually likes Duke. She's been sneaking food to him when Dad's not around. Before Will could respond, Jeremy's phone buzzed with a text message. The boy's face went white as he read it. It's from Dad. He says the vote is happening now and Duke is going to be removed from the park tomorrow morning. Animal Control is coming with a court order. Inside the community center, the emergency session had reached its breaking point. Mayor Sims was calling for order as shouting matches erupted throughout the room. Bradford stood at the microphone, his voice rising above the chaos with practiced authority. The safety of our children must come first, he declared. I move that the City Council vote immediately to remove this animal from public property and transfer him to appropriate authorities for evaluation and potential relocation. I second the motion, called out Councilmember Robert Hayes, one of Bradford's longtime political allies. Dorothy Patterson struggled to her feet, her age making the movement difficult, but her determination unwavering. This is a travesty of justice, she cried out. You're condemning an innocent animal based on lies and manufactured fear. Will burst through the doors just as Mayor Sims called for the vote. Wait, he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. Before you vote, there's something this community needs to hear. Behind him, Jeremy Bradford walked slowly down the center aisle, his young face set with the kind of courage that only comes from choosing to do what's right despite the personal cost. Dad, he said, his voice shaking but audible throughout the suddenly quiet room, I can't let you do this anymore. Marcus Bradford's face went ashen as he realized what was about to happen. Jeremy, sit down. This isn't the time or place for— 8 years ago, I wasn't attacked by a German Shepherd, Jeremy announced to the packed room. I fell off my bike and got hurt on barbed wire. My father made up the story about a dog attack to justify his hatred of Duke. He's been lying to all of you because he wants to buy the park land for his resort development. The community center erupted in chaos as 3 years of careful planning collapsed around Marcus Bradford like a house of cards. Will watched the man's face cycle through shock, denial, and finally a cold fury that revealed the calculating predator he'd always been beneath his polished exterior. The vote was postponed indefinitely as Officer Martinez moved to question Jeremy formally, and Mayor Sims demanded an immediate investigation into Bradford's allegations against Duke, but Will knew this was far from over. Cornered animals were often at their most dangerous, and Marcus Bradford had just been exposed as something much more threatening than anyone had imagined. The tragedy struck at 4:47 a.m. on Friday morning when Will Thompson's weakened heart finally succumbed to the overwhelming stress of the past weeks. He'd spent a sleepless night poring over Elizabeth's journal, reliving memories of Duke that grief had buried so deeply he'd forgotten their existence entirely. The emotional shock of remembering and the crushing guilt of having abandoned his beloved companion proved too much for his 72-year-old cardiovascular system. Mrs. Henderson, his next-door neighbor, found him collapsed on his kitchen floor when she came to check on him after noticing his morning newspaper still in its plastic sleeve at 9 a.m. The paramedics who responded to her frantic 911 call worked for 23 minutes to restart his heart. But Will Thompson was pronounced dead at Magnolia Springs General Hospital at 10:14 a.m., Elizabeth's journal still clutched in his lifeless hands. The news spread through the small Alabama town like wildfire in drought season. Dorothy Patterson received the call from Mrs. Henderson and immediately collapsed into her kitchen chair, sobbing uncontrollably for the man who'd become Duke's most passionate defender. Margaret Chen Williams heard about Will's death from her mailman and felt something break inside her chest. The same devastating emptiness she'd experienced when her husband of 40 years had announced he was leaving her for his secretary. But it was Duke's reaction that broke the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. Officer Rebecca Martinez was the one tasked with informing the German Shepherd of his protector's death. Though she later admitted she wasn't sure how much animals truly understood about human mortality. She found Duke at his usual post beside the Civil War monument, amber eyes alert and scanning the park for Will's familiar figure. "He's not coming, boy," Martinez whispered, kneeling beside the shepherd and gently stroking his scarred head. "Will's not coming back." Duke seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed. His ears drooped, his tail stopped its occasional wag, and he let out a low whine that sounded hauntingly human in its grief. For the first time since arriving in Memorial Park, Duke abandoned his post. He walked slowly to the bench where Will had sat each morning, circled it 3 times, then lay down beside it with his massive head resting on his paws. He wouldn't move for the next 18 hours, refusing food and water, ignoring the steady stream of well-meaning visitors who tried to coax him away from his vigil. Dr. Patricia Hawkins arrived from the county animal shelter with professional concern and personal affection for the grieving dog. "Animals can die from broken hearts," she explained to the small crowd that had gathered around Duke's motionless form. The stress hormones released during intense grief can cause fatal cardiac events, especially in older animals who've experienced multiple traumas. Marcus Bradford chose that moment, while the community was reeling from Will's death and Duke's visible heartbreak, to deliver his final, devastating blow. He arrived at Memorial Park with a court order signed by Judge William Morrison, a longtime friend and business associate who'd been convinced that the German Shepherd posed an immediate threat to public safety. "This dog is now officially classified as a dangerous animal," Bradford announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the cold satisfaction of victory. "Animal control will be here within the hour to take him into custody for evaluation. If he's deemed irreparably aggressive, he'll be humanely euthanized." Dorothy Patterson struggled to her feet from where she'd been sitting beside Duke, her arthritic joints protesting but her spirit blazing with righteous fury. "You heartless monster!" she spat, her voice shaking with rage and grief. "Will Thompson is dead, this poor creature is mourning his best friend, and you choose this moment to strike. Have you no decency left in your soul?" Bradford's expression remained coldly impassive. "Mrs. Patterson, this is a matter of public safety, not sentiment. The dog's erratic behavior, refusing to eat, ignoring commands, displaying obvious signs of psychological instability, proves he's no longer suitable for interaction with civilians." Margaret Chen Williams stepped forward, her recently divorced status having taught her to recognize manipulation in all its forms. Psychological instability? He's grieving. Any creature with a heart would be devastated by losing someone they loved. "Exactly my point," Bradford replied smoothly. "Emotional instability in a trained attack animal makes him unpredictably dangerous. The court has agreed that immediate intervention is necessary." The arrival of the animal control van at 3:15 p.m. felt like a death knell to Duke's supporters. Officer Frank Stevens emerged from the vehicle with a reinforced leash and a tranquilizer gun, his expression grim but professional. Stevens had been doing this job for 15 years and had never enjoyed the difficult cases, but court orders were court orders. "I'm sorry, folks," Stevens said quietly to the assembled crowd. "I've got legal paperwork requiring me to take custody of this animal. Please step back and let me do my job." Duke lifted his head as Stevens approached, those intelligent amber eyes taking in the leash, the tranquilizer gun, the official uniform. The shepherd's expression held no fear, only a weary resignation that broke the hearts of everyone watching. He'd been abandoned before, betrayed by humans he'd trusted, and his body language suggested he'd expected this moment to come eventually. "Easy, boy," Stevens murmured, moving slowly to avoid triggering any defensive responses. "Let's make this as peaceful as possible." But as Stevens reached for Duke's collar, something unprecedented happened. The German Shepherd didn't resist, didn't struggle, didn't display any of the aggressive behaviors Bradford had spent weeks claiming were inevitable. Instead, Duke simply looked directly at Bradford with an expression so human, so full of disappointed understanding, that several people in the crowd audibly gasped. Then Duke did something that would be talked about in Magnolia Springs for generations. He walked calmly to the Civil War monument, sat down in the exact spot where he'd maintained his faithful vigil for weeks, and howled. It wasn't the savage sound of a dangerous animal. It was the mournful cry of a soul in anguish, a keening lament that seemed to carry all the grief and betrayal and lost hope in the world. The sound echoed across Memorial Park and into the surrounding neighborhood, bringing residents running from their homes and businesses. It was the kind of primal cry that touched something deep in the human spirit, a reminder of loss and loyalty that transcended species boundaries. Children began crying, adults wiped away tears, and even Officer Stevens stood frozen with his tranquilizer gun lowered, unable to bring himself to sedate an animal displaying such profound emotional depth. Bradford watched the scene with growing unease, realizing that his moment of triumph was transforming into something that might galvanize the community against him more effectively than any of Will Thompson's passionate speeches ever could. The image of a grieving dog being dragged away while crying out his heartbreak was exactly the kind of emotional catalyst that could turn public opinion permanently against Bradford's development plans. "Get on with it," Bradford snapped at Stevens. "The longer you wait, the more difficult this becomes." But Stevens hesitated, his professional instincts warring with his human compassion. "Mr. Bradford, this animal isn't displaying any aggressive behaviors. Maybe we should wait until—" "The court order is clear," Bradford interrupted. "Remove the animal immediately or face contempt charges." As Stevens reluctantly raised the tranquilizer gun, Duke's howling intensified, joined now by the voices of his human supporters. Dorothy Patterson began singing Amazing Grace in her wavering soprano, a song she'd learned at her husband's funeral 30 years earlier. Margaret Chen Williams joined in, then Sarah Beth Coleman, then dozens of other voices until the entire park resonated with the old hymn's message of redemption and grace. The last thing Will Thompson supporters saw before Duke was loaded into the animal control van was the German Shepherd's amber eyes fixed on the bench where his friend had sat each morning. Even sedated, even betrayed once again by the humans he'd devoted his life to protecting, Duke's loyalty remained unbroken. As the van disappeared down Main Street, carrying Duke toward an uncertain fate, Marcus Bradford stood alone in Memorial Park. His victory felt strangely hollow as he surveyed the faces around him, faces filled with disgust, disappointment, and a hardening resolve that suggested his troubles were far from over. The community had lost its gentlest defender and its most passionate advocate in the same week. But sometimes, in the darkest moments, heroes emerge from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, the truth has a way of surfacing just when evil thinks it has finally won. The truth began to unravel at 6:23 a.m. on Saturday morning when Jennifer Thompson arrived in Magnolia Springs for her father's funeral. Will's 45-year-old daughter stepped out of her rental car at the Magnolia Springs Inn with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who'd taken the first available flight from Seattle upon hearing the devastating news. She'd spent the red-eye flight wrestling with guilt over the distance that had grown between her and her father since her mother's death, and the crushing realization that she'd never have the chance to repair their fractured relationship. Jennifer's first stop was her childhood home, where she intended to begin the heartbreaking process of sorting through her father's belongings. What she found in the kitchen pantry, hidden exactly where her mother's journal had indicated, changed everything. Behind the flour canister sat a weathered cardboard box containing Duke's official adoption papers, veterinary records, and training certificates, all bearing the names Will and Elizabeth Thompson as Duke's legal owners. The documentation told a story that made Jennifer sink to her knees on the kitchen linoleum, overwhelmed by memories she'd suppressed along with her own grief. Duke hadn't been just any therapy dog. He'd been specifically trained to assist Alzheimer's patients and their families. Elizabeth had worked with a local organization for 6 months to prepare Duke for his role in their household, and the German Shepherd had become an integral part of her mother's care routine. But it was the final document in the box that broke Jennifer's heart completely, a letter addressed to her in her mother's handwriting, dated just days before Elizabeth's death. "My dearest Jennifer," it began, "I know your father's grief will try to erase all the beautiful memories, including our wonderful Duke. When you read this, please help them find each other again. Duke was the bridge between your father's sorrow and his healing. They need each other more than either of them realizes." Jennifer immediately called Officer Rebecca Martinez, her voice shaking as she explained what she'd discovered. "Officer Martinez, I have legal proof that Duke belongs to my family. He's not a stray, he's my father's dog, and he's been trying to come home." The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation that Martinez had been quietly conducting into Marcus Bradford's allegations. With Jennifer's documentation and Jeremy Bradford's testimony about his father's manufactured evidence, the case against Duke collapsed entirely. But more damaging for Marcus Bradford was what Jennifer found when she accessed her father's recent phone records and internet search history. Will Thompson had been investigating Bradford Development Group's financial situation for the past 2 weeks, driven by a teacher's instinct that something didn't add up about Bradford's sudden campaign against Duke. What Will had discovered would have exposed Bradford's desperation if the elderly man had lived long enough to present his findings to the community. Bradford Development Group was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. The company had overextended itself on several failed projects, and Bradford's investors were demanding returns on their $50 million commitment to the Memorial Park Resort development. Without the park land acquisition, Bradford faced personal financial ruin and potential fraud charges from investors who'd been promised guaranteed returns. Jennifer found her father's handwritten notes tucked into his copy of the Magnolia Springs City Charter. Bradford needs park sale to avoid bankruptcy. Duke's presence makes sale politically impossible. Remove Duke equals remove opposition to development. Question: what else is Bradford willing to do to save his business? The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Hawkins had been troubled by Duke's placement in the county animal shelter's isolation facility, where dogs awaiting dangerous animal evaluation were kept in solitary confinement. When she arrived for her Saturday morning veterinary rounds, she found Duke's kennel empty and the night security guard, Tommy Walsh, waiting nervously in the parking lot. "Doc, I couldn't let them do it," Walsh confessed, his weathered face creased with worry. "That Bradford fellow came by around midnight with some fancy paperwork saying the dog needed to be moved to a specialized facility for immediate euthanization. But something felt wrong about the whole thing. The paperwork looked official, but Bradford was too eager, you know. So I called my buddy at the sheriff's department to verify, and they said no such order had been issued." Walsh had hidden Duke in his own barn overnight. risking his job but unable to stand by while what appeared to be an illegal seizure took place. "That dog's been through enough," Walsh said simply. "Whatever's going on here, it isn't right." Dr. Hawkins immediately contacted Officer Martinez, who arrived at Walsh's property within 20 minutes. They found Duke in remarkably good condition considering his ordeal, though the shepherd's eyes held a wariness that hadn't been there before his traumatic removal from the park. When Martinez approached the kennel where Walsh had been keeping him, Duke's tail wagged tentatively, a sign that his faith in human kindness, while severely damaged, wasn't completely broken. "Bradford tried to have Duke killed," Martinez said grimly as she documented the illegal seizure attempt. "This goes way beyond zoning disputes and public safety concerns. This is criminal conspiracy." The emergency that had been brewing since Will Thompson's death reached its breaking point when Jennifer Thompson arrived at the Saturday afternoon city council meeting with her father's research, Duke's ownership documents, and a fury that burned white-hot with protective instinct. The community center was packed even more densely than the previous week's meeting, with residents who'd heard rumors about Jennifer's discoveries and wanted to learn the truth about the man who'd been manipulating their fears. Mayor Patricia Sims called the meeting to order with visible tension etched across her features. The past week's events had shaken her faith in her ability to govern effectively, and the possibility that she'd been deceived by one of the town's most prominent citizens made her question her own judgment. "Before we address any other business," Mayor Sims announced, "we need to hear from Jennifer Thompson, who has information relevant to the situation with the German Shepherd known as Duke." Jennifer stood slowly, her mother's letter clutched in her trembling hands. When she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet authority that had made her father such an effective teacher, but underneath lay a steel that came from years of building a successful career in Seattle's competitive tech industry. "My name is Jennifer Thompson, and I'm here to bring my dog home," she began, her words cutting through the room's tense silence like a blade. "Duke isn't a stray. He isn't a public menace. He's a registered therapy dog who belongs to my family, and he's been trying to return to the people who love him while this community threw rocks at him and treated him like a criminal." The room erupted in murmurs as Jennifer presented Duke's official documentation to the city council, but her next revelation silenced the crowd completely. "My father spent his final weeks investigating Marcus Bradford's financial situation," Jennifer continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "What he discovered was that Mr. Bradford is facing bankruptcy and desperately needs the Memorial Park land sale to avoid personal and professional ruin. Duke's presence in the park made that sale politically impossible, so Bradford launched a systematic campaign of lies and manipulation to have him removed." Marcus Bradford shot to his feet from his position near the back of the room, his face flushed with rage and desperation. "That's completely fabricated," he shouted. "Your father was a grieving old man who'd lost touch with reality. These so-called documents could have been forged by anyone." Officer Martinez stood up from her seat near the front row, her hand resting on her service weapon in a gesture that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "Mr. Bradford, we also have testimony from the animal shelter's security guard that you attempted to illegally remove Duke from county custody last night with falsified euthanization orders." The color drained from Bradford's face as he realized the full scope of his exposure. There's been a misunderstanding. I was operating under advice from my legal counsel that your legal counsel didn't authorize attempted murder of a protected animal," Jennifer interrupted, her voice cutting like ice. "And they certainly didn't authorize the fraud, conspiracy, and perjury you've committed to serve your financial interests." Jeremy Bradford, who'd been sitting in stunned silence throughout the meeting, slowly stood up beside his father. The 16-year-old's face was pale but determined as he addressed the packed room. "Everything Ms. Thompson is saying is true," he said, his young voice shaking but audible. My father has been lying to all of you for weeks. He hired actors to fake attack videos. He bribed people to file false reports. He made me lie about being bitten by a dog that never hurt me. The community center erupted in chaos as 3 weeks of carefully constructed deception collapsed around Marcus Bradford like a controlled demolition. Voices rose in anger, shock, and betrayal as neighbors turned to look at the man who'd manipulated their fears for his own financial gain. But it was Dorothy Patterson who delivered the final blow to Bradford's credibility. The elderly woman stood slowly from her front row seat, her weathered hands gripping her purse with white-knuckled determination. "Marcus Bradford," she said, her voice carrying across the room with biblical authority, "you are the most shameful excuse for a human being I have ever encountered. That poor dog has done nothing but love and protect this community, while you've done nothing but lie and manipulate for money. If there's any justice in this world, you'll spend your remaining years making amends for the cruelty you've inflicted on an innocent animal and the people who loved him." As Officer Martinez moved to formally question Bradford about the illegal seizure attempt, Jennifer Thompson felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Margaret Chen Williams, tears streaming down the older woman's face. "Your father would be so proud," Margaret whispered. "He fought for Duke until his last breath, and now you're finishing what he started." But even as justice seemed within reach, Jennifer knew that exposing Bradford's crimes was only the beginning. Duke was still traumatized, still separated from the community he'd protected, still bearing the emotional scars of betrayal and abandonment. Bringing him home would require more than legal documentation. It would require healing wounds that went deeper than anyone had imagined. The truth had finally surfaced, but the real work of redemption was just beginning. The reunion took place on a golden September afternoon in Memorial Park, exactly 1 week after Will Thompson's funeral and 3 days after Marcus Bradford's arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and animal cruelty. Jennifer Thompson sat on her father's favorite bench, her heart hammering with nervous anticipation as Officer Martinez's patrol car pulled into the parking area. Through the rear window, she could see Duke's familiar silhouette, and the sight brought tears to her eyes that she'd been holding back for days. Duke emerged from the vehicle with cautious dignity, his amber eyes scanning the park that had been both his sanctuary and his battlefield. The German Shepherd moved slowly, favoring his injured leg more than usual, a physical manifestation of the emotional trauma he'd endured. When his gaze found Jennifer sitting on Will's bench, he stopped completely, his head tilting with the confused recognition of a creature who'd learned not to trust his own hopes. "Hey, Duke," Jennifer called softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Do you remember me? I'm Will's daughter. I'm family." The shepherd's ears pricked forward at the sound of Will's name, and something shifted in his expression. Memories seemed to flicker behind those intelligent eyes. Images of a younger Jennifer visiting her parents' home, of playing fetch in their backyard, of lazy Sunday afternoons when Duke had been part of a family that loved him unconditionally. Jennifer reached into her purse and pulled out Elizabeth's old tennis ball, faded and worn from years of faithful service. Duke's reaction was immediate and profound. His tail began wagging with increasing enthusiasm, his whole body seeming to lighten as recognition flooded through him. This wasn't just any human offering friendship. This was family, this was home, this was the connection he'd been searching for through months of loneliness and confusion. Duke approached slowly, each step deliberate and hopeful. When he reached Jennifer's side, he gently placed his massive head on her knee and looked up at her with eyes that held forgiveness, relief, and a love that transcended the barriers between species. Jennifer wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in his fur, whispering apologies and promises that came from the deepest places of her heart. "I'm so sorry we lost each other," she whispered. "I'm sorry Dad forgot, and I'm sorry I stayed away so long. But we're going to fix this, okay? We're going to be a family again." The crowd that had gathered to witness Duke's homecoming began with the core group of supporters who'd fought for him throughout the ordeal. Dorothy Patterson arrived with a care package of homemade dog treats and a new collar embroidered with Duke Thompson, local hero. Margaret Chen Williams brought her 6-year-old granddaughter Lily, who wanted to personally thank the dog who'd saved her from kidnapping. But as word spread through Magnolia Springs that Duke was returning home, the gathering grew into something approaching a town celebration. Families arrived with children who'd only heard stories about the hero dog. Elderly residents came to pay their respects to Will Thompson's memory, and even some of the people who'd initially feared Duke showed up to offer their apologies and support. Sarah Beth Coleman approached with her toddler, who'd made a handmade card decorated with crayon drawings of dogs and rainbows. "We wanted to say thank you," she told Jennifer, her voice heavy with emotion, "and to say we're sorry for being so quick to judge. Duke saved our community in more ways than we realized." Dr. Patricia Hawkins arrived with a comprehensive medical evaluation and a treatment plan for Duke's ongoing care. "His physical injuries are healing well," she reported to Jennifer, "but the emotional trauma will take time." Dogs like Duke, who've experienced multiple abandonments, can develop anxiety and trust issues. He'll need patience, consistency, and lots of love. Jennifer nodded, understanding completely. "He'll have all of that and more. We're going to make sure he never feels abandoned again." The surprise that brought tears to everyone's eyes came when Jeremy Bradford arrived with his mother, Linda. The 16-year-old approached Duke cautiously, his face etched with guilt and remorse. Linda Bradford, who'd filed for divorce the moment she learned the extent of her husband's deception, stood beside her son with quiet dignity. "Duke," Jeremy said softly, kneeling beside the shepherd, "I'm sorry for everything my father did to you. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. You didn't deserve any of the pain he caused." Duke studied the teenager for a long moment, those wise amber eyes seeming to peer directly into Jeremy's soul. Then, in a gesture that exemplified the forgiveness that defined his character, Duke gently licked the boy's hand. Jeremy burst into tears, overwhelmed by the grace of an animal who'd chosen mercy over revenge. Linda Bradford approached Jennifer with visible nervousness. "Ms. Thompson, I want you to know that I had no idea what Marcus was planning. If I'd known he was capable of such cruelty, I would have stopped him. Your father was a good man, and Duke is a blessing to this community." Jennifer accepted the apology with the kind of grace her parents had taught her. "None of this was your fault, Mrs. Bradford. You and Jeremy are victims too." As the afternoon wore on, Jennifer made an announcement that surprised even Duke's most devoted supporters. "I've made a decision about my future," she told the gathered crowd. "I'm moving back to Magnolia Springs permanently. My father left me this house, and Duke needs stability. But more than that, I need to be home. I need to be part of the community that loved my parents and protected my dog when I couldn't." The applause that greeted this announcement was heartfelt and sustained. Dorothy Patterson wiped away tears of joy, while Margaret Chen Williams clapped so enthusiastically that her arthritis protested. The prospect of having Jennifer Thompson, successful, educated, and fiercely protective of Duke's welfare, as a permanent resident, meant that Duke would never again lack for advocates. Mayor Patricia Sims arrived for the evening's culminating event, the official dedication of Duke's Corner in Memorial Park. The City Council had voted unanimously to create a permanent memorial space, honoring both Duke's service and Will Thompson's advocacy. A bronze plaque would be installed beside the Civil War monument reading, "In honor of Duke, faithful guardian and protector, and Will Thompson, teacher and defender of the innocent." Their legacy reminds us that heroism comes in many forms, and love transcends all boundaries. As the sun began to set over Memorial Park, painting the sky in shades of amber that matched Duke's eyes, Jennifer sat on her father's bench with Duke lying contentedly at her feet. The German Shepherd's breathing was peaceful, his body relaxed in a way it hadn't been for months. He was home, he was loved, and he was safe. "Dad would be so happy," Jennifer whispered, stroking Duke's head. "He'd love knowing that we found each other again, that we're going to take care of each other." Duke's tail thumped once against the ground, and Jennifer could almost hear her father's voice carried on the evening breeze. "Love multiplies when you divide it." Will Thompson had been right. The love he'd shared with Elizabeth had grown to encompass Duke, and now that love would continue through Jennifer's commitment to the dog who'd captured her father's heart. In the distance, children played on the swings while their parents watched with easy contentment, no longer afraid of the gentle guardian who watched over them all. Magnolia Springs had weathered its crisis and emerged stronger, more united, and infinitely more compassionate. Duke was home, and home was wherever love dwelt strongest. Sometimes life's most profound blessings come disguised as burdens we're too broken to recognize. Will Thompson thought he was protecting a stray dog, but Duke was actually protecting him, guarding not just a park, but a grieving heart that had forgotten how to hope. Like so many of us who've lost spouses, parents, or dear friends, Will had unconsciously buried beautiful memories along with his pain, thinking it would hurt less to forget than to remember. But love doesn't diminish when we try to hide it. It simply waits patiently for us to be strong enough to embrace it again. Duke's story reminds us that loyalty transcends memory, that second chances are never too late, and that sometimes the family we need most is the one that chooses us. In our golden years, when children live far away and old friends grow fewer, we might overlook the connections right in front of us. The neighbor who waves each morning, the pet that offers unconditional comfort, the community member who needs our advocacy. What Duke in your life are you not seeing clearly? Have you ever experienced a second chance that felt like a miracle? Share your stories below. Our community wants to hear how love found you when you needed it most.